I'm Eberhard Wolff. I'm with Swecklab. We are a consultancy in Germany. As you can probably tell by my accent, we are a rather small company, but we claim that we actually make the difference in the project. So we are rather senior people from different backgrounds. I'm more into software architecture. I've written a few books about microservices, for example. I'm doing software architecture on Stream. That's a stream about software architecture, and it's now more than 300 episodes. I'm a regular conference speaker, as you can probably tell, and I would like to talk about teams and software making an impact as an architect. And I would like to start with hard skills. So software architecture is about software, who would have known? And therefore technical skills seem to be essential. And I would actually argue that if you look at architecture, what it actually means, in my opinion, it's about the quality characteristics of the system that you want to design, things like performance, maintainability, user-friendliness, security, and so on. And that leads to certain technologies that you're going to use in your system, which is just one part of the game. I mean, if you claim that you can make a very user-friendly application by using Angular, well, you can also make a very user-unfriendly application with Angular. So there is more to it than just pure technologies. And then there is the other part, which is the maintainability of software, which seems to be quite important because it will also affect the costs of the system in the long run. And that is something that you can deal with by building a good structure of the system. This is software architecture on one slide. And obviously, I would argue if you claim that you're a software architect, you should have some understanding about how to do this. So yes, there are hard skills. And this is something that I'm not going to argue about because, you know, there are so many talks that talk about software architecture. There are so many books that talk about software architecture, and they all talk about this. So I could just do another talk that does the very same, and that's not what I'm going to do. So I'm not going to talk about that in a lot of detail. And I would also argue if I have very good skills in this regard, if I have a very good understanding about how to build a system, it's not useful at all if nobody listens to me. Because at the end of the day, it's about teams building software. And I would actually argue that you can learn these hard skills quite easily. So there is ISAQB, for example, that's an association that works on certifying software architects. And there is a body of knowledge that makes you a good software architect, and you can just go to some trainings there and learn about that. And I'm one of the trainers who do these kinds of things. One of the things that I think is interesting is, should an architect code? And I have to admit that I did some controversial slides about that, which you're going to see in a minute, to, well, make you think about it. So basically, if you claim that you are an architect and you still want to write some code, it means that you implement some part of the system. And I would argue that there is just so much code that you can write. If you are responsible for architecture, it means that this will consume probably a lot of your time, so there is not a lot of code that you can actually write. But there is also this thing that, you know, it won't lead you to the ivory tower, so you will still stay in touch with the code and the system, and I can somehow relate to that. But I'm also not sure because, you know, there is a team, so there are, I don't know, let's say it's 5 programmers, not a very large team. So there is just so much code that you can see. Those other people will also write a lot of code, and it's quite likely that you won't see all of it. And lately, I'm watching a series in German television, Fire and Flame, Feuer und Flamme, and it's about the fire brigades in Germany. And there was an interview with some person that was sort of a leader. So there's a small group of firefighters. It's 2 or 3 people, and there is sort of a leader. And that leader said, well, I must stay away from fighting the fire myself, even though it is fun and I can do it, because I have to lead and coordinate. So once there is a fire, those people are the ones who try to understand what the situation is, try to understand what needs to be done. Those are the ones to actually lead. and that's what they are supposed to do. So as soon as they actually fight the fire, they can't lead and coordinate. And which means that there is a different position, right? It's not someone who actually fights the fire, it's someone who tries to make it happen. And there was another part in that interview that I thought was interesting, and the person was talking to the interviewer and said, you couldn't do it because you don't know what firefighting is about. So it's something where you have to have some knowledge about what's actually going on. So I couldn't do it either. Probably you couldn't do it unless you are a firefighter. And therefore, there is a specific skill set that you need. And I think that resonates with what we need in our industry, right? We need people who have a technical understandanding, but probably don't work on the code themselves. Which leads to the next question, and I'm actually inclined to try to ask that question to you. So what is the most important skill in IT? Is because we ask people at the tech the stream that I was talking about, and I didn't really think about possible answers, right? I mean, analytical thinking, there is a good reason why you would say that's the most important skill. And by far the most commonly given answer was communication, like exactly that word. And it works, right? If you just go to some room with people like you and you ask what's the most important skill in IT, you get these kinds of results usually. And so you can watch the episode. The way that we did that was we did some video interviews, and we also had people write down what they think was the most important skill on a piece of paper, and we would read that out in that episode. And I'm afraid, and I do apologize, that this is an episode in German, like most of the ones that I give in this presentation. But still, it means that communication and soft skills are actually quite important in your opinion. It's not my opinion, it's your opinion. Now, you could argue that this is IT in general, right? It's a broad field, and we are now talking about software architecture. So what I did is I asked the question, what is the main challenge in software architecture? And I did that with a survey on social media. This is the posting that I did, and I did that on Blue Sky and Mastodon to avoid that fascist platform. And it turns out that the main challenge in software architecture is, well, communication, organization, and architecture, the evolution of systems. It's actually a little bit broader. So it's not just, well, that one word and not just soft skills. So it's a little bit broader, but it's still primarily about soft skills. And again, you can watch that episode. You can take a look at the original postings and look that all up. What does that mean? Well, the most important skill in IT is communication. That's what you say, or what those people who participated in that survey say. And the main challenge in software architecture is also largely soft skills. And that means that software architecture is a people business. And you know it, because that's the answer that you usually give, which leads to the question, why would you code? Because that doesn't really solve that main issue. It also leads to the question, why would AI tools solve that problem, right? Unless we get rid of the people, but that's a different thing. And I would argue that if I look at a project, there are, on the one side, people who are, well, developing the stuff, who are doing the operations for that system, who are doing UX and QA and so on. So there are a lot of technical roles, and I'm afraid that I probably forgot a few of them. And then there are lots of different stakeholders. There is management, and there are the users. and they all work on that project. And we are usually the ones, I still think I'm a technical person, who will make it happen, and the other are the ones who tell us what we need to do and what the direction should be. Which leads to the question, how can I make an impact? And it seems that making an impact in this situation is by convincing people to do what you think is the right way. I mean, as I said before, I do have hard skills, so I have an understanding about what the architecture should look like. So I should now start convincing the team that this is the right way. So it means that I would convince others. And it's not just about developers, but it's also usually about managers, about stakeholders. So there are quite a few people who need to be convinced. And I'm not actually sure whether this is really the right approach and whether this is really helpful. Because one problem is that this in a way means that those people would do your bidding, which means that you're the one who is actually thinking and the other are just the ones who are executing the plan. And I'm not sure whether that makes a lot of sense. I will talk about that in a lot more detail in a few slides. So I would argue that, well, that's also the other problem. So the only person that you can actually really change is yourself. I mean, you can try to change other people, but that's much harder if it's even possible at all. Which means making an impact means communication. And that means you need to understand the different perspectives. If you look at the situation that I've just shown on that slide, there are very different people with different perspectives on the project. They all have one part of the whole picture. So you have to understand them. You have to provide feedback about your perspective on the project. So therefore you need to learn and make your knowledge usable. And one group of people that I would like to talk about in more detail are managers. And the sort of impression that I get sometimes is that there is the management, and management obviously tells us what to do. So we are just technical people, and those are the leaders, and they will tell us what we need to do. Which leads to the question, would you like to be able to override management decisions? So who would like to be able to override management decisions, as in they won't happen, and you are the one who are making the decisions? Who would rather not want to do that? That just makes you the manager. So there is one person who I think has shown up. That's, by the way, sort of the catch, right? And so the large majority, I would say, like everyone else except for that one person, basically, and that other person who had some doubts, said that they would like to override management decisions. This is a common exercise in my training, so it's a question that I tend to ask people in my trainings. And this is the typical result, that people want to override management decisions. And it's a weird thing, because after a discussion, usually what turns out is, actually, what we want to do is we want to have a discussion with those people, and we want to be taken seriously. And it's, I have to admit, I'm happy that management does management things. So, you know, I want to build up a software architecture. That's one perspective. That's a technical perspective. There is management. They have deadlines and, you know, resources, budgets, these kinds of things. I don't want to deal with that. So I want to have a conversation where we can talk to one another and come to some conclusion. That's what I want to do. I don't want to override that stuff, because then I would eventually become a manager, and that's not what I want to do. And you can always escalate, right? So you should be able, at least if you're officially a software architect, to somehow escalate. So it's again about communication. And so I was talking about SwagLab. And at SwagLab, I'm one of the shareholders, Gesellschafter, but I'm not a managing director, so I'm not, Geschäftsführer is the German term. And that's by intention, because, well, we have 3 managing directors who can basically run the company. Why would I do that? Why would I become the fourth person? What's the value I can add? The value that I can add is I can go to some conferences and give talks. So I can do these kinds of things. I can do consulting. So why would I care about managing the company? Obviously, they listen to me, right? And I have a saying, like everyone else who is in the company, and I'm quite happy with that. And I would like to keep it that way. So I would actually argue that this thing is wrong because I could ask you about some ways to not do what you're told. And one thing that you can easily do is just ignore it. And maybe, management will forget about it. And I guess you do that all the time. I did it. We all do it all the time. So this is not how it works, right? It's not like there is management and then we as technical people are in the project and we say, yes, we are going to do this. Instead, we will have our way in one way or another. And the problem that I have here is that somehow often it seems to me that architects just say, okay, this is a management decision. That's not my decision. They did that decision. And who am I to even ask them for any reason? How could I influence them? Well, obviously you can, right? You can escalate, you can talk to them. So there is a number of ways to solve the problem. I have to admit that as a consultant, I am paid to provide feedback about the project. So I'm in a different role, right? So I'm never in the role where management says, okay, please do that. It's rather that management asks me for some opinion, and therefore, to provide criticism is actually what I'm paid for. So this is different from an architect who might not be paid for just criticizing things, but actually needs to get things done. But I'm not sure why architects wouldn't be able to do that too. And therefore, you should provide feedback and feedback to management, which means saying, well, this is a management decision and I can't interfere with it. It's, I think, almost obviously wrong. And there are even strategies around that. So there is fearless change, which is a set of strategies to introduce ideas into an organization. So one idea is the token. So the idea of that pattern is to keep a new idea alive in a person's memory, hand out tokens that can be identified with the topic being introduced. I use this pattern because I think it's something that is quite interesting and different from what you would usually do. And because Linda Rising actually used this pattern on me. So I did a workshop about fearless, or participated in a workshop about fearless change, 15 years ago or so, and she handed out cards with the patterns, and I still have them. So she applied that idea, right? Those cards are a token of fearless change itself. Another pattern would be local sponsor, ask for help from first line management. When your boss supports the task you are doing to introduce the new idea, you can be even more effective. And fearless change is actually something, is a game where you would set a goal for yourself, some change that you want to have in the organization, and you apply patterns to solve that problem, and you play that game with a group of people. And we did that in one episode of the stream. And what I like about this is, so if you want to change things, you can get a group of people together and you have a constructive, fun conversation about how to change things. So here is a strategy that you can apply to actually make things happen in your organization. And it works. I mean, even though if you're just, one of those developers, no special title, because you can always ask people for help. You can always, provide tokens and these kinds of things. I also did an episode, this one is actually in English with Linda, where we also spoke about these ideas. So I would argue the communication, in particular concerning management, is interesting because they think about budgets, deadlines, and politics, which means it's our task to translate what we are doing into this world. So if I want to have a better architecture, does that really mean that we can save money, that we are faster in the project? If we are not, why is this a good decision? And maybe it is, maybe there are other reasons, but thinking about that is something that I would really recommend to you. It's another perspective. And if you want to have something, if you want to have a very beautiful architecture, you should probably do that at home. In business, it's about business, and therefore it's about effectiveness and efficiency. And then you have to somehow articulate what your plan is in these terms. So I would, and usually there is so much stuff that you can decide. There is so much stuff that you can optimize. There is not a lack of opportunities to do something better or to change something. So you have to focus and you have to prioritize. And I think this is something that helps you to prioritize and to filter out ideas that probably don't make a lot of sense. The same is true for developers. So I'm, as I said, an architecture consultant. So usually when I'm sitting in a room, I have the least experience with the system. And I'm also the person who has the least idea about the domain because I'm just a consultant, which means that developers who spend the whole day working on the code and the details, they are experts for that. And it's very clear that they are experts because that's what they do every day. So I can ask them for feedback about my ideas. I can ask them about their problems that they are having, trying to solve those problems. And I wouldn't consider myself a super developer, quite the opposite. I'm not a very good developer because, I'm not doing that every day for, 8 hours or whatever you develop as a developer. And that's, I think, something that is sometimes forgotten, where architects consider themselves superior in technical knowledge, and that doesn't make a lot of sense because you should work on a different level. And therefore, your goal should be to support developers because those are the ones who are actually doing the sort of real work, who are creating the real code. So communication. There are some things that I learned to be helpful. And I spend a lot of my time talking to people because, that's what life is as a consultant. And therefore, the goal is to get a clear picture about what is going on. And one thing that I find interesting is if there is a contradiction. So if one person says, this is a huge problem, the other person says, no, that's not a huge problem. Okay, so there is a contradiction. So it means that there are different ideas. And I find them interesting because one of those two opinions can only be true. So you have to figure out which one is the one that is actually true. And then you have to, and if you don't have that common understanding, then you won't be able to work effectively on the problems. So finding contradictions in a perspective itself. So if someone says, okay, this is how we do things here, and here's the exception. So why is there an exception? These kinds of things, or also if people have different opinions from other people. And the other thing is, so if someone says, okay, we are going to do it this way. We want to use that framework. We want to generate our documentation with an AI system, whatever it is. That might be something where you don't understand why they're using that. Why do they have that opinion? And you have to realize that in their mind that idea makes sense. So I've been in a project where they were using some very old-fashioned and I thought weird UI framework. And I was surprised by that until I learned that one of the committers is actually part of the project. So obviously then it makes sense, right? And it makes sense in their heads. And it's something that was mysterious to me because I thought, why would they use that niche technology? Then it makes sense. And then you can act on it and figure out whether this is really stupid. And the problem here is, so there is some architecture and they say we're using this framework. Well, nobody uses that framework anymore. It's a niche technology. So that's obvious, right? It's something that you just figured out in less than 5 minutes. It's really, really obvious. So it's not hard to figure out. So the information is not that there is this problem or this perceived problem. The question is, why is there this obvious problem? What's the explanation for that? And if you don't understand why this is logical, why it makes sense to them, you won't be able to solve the problem if it is a problem at all. And that is, I think, one of the tough problems that you have in architecture and also in particular in consulting. And that means that you have to understand their values, their motivation. Maybe it's because that person was a contributor that they did that. Maybe it even means that there is not a lot of risk. Maybe it's because that person wanted to, work on their side projects in a business context. So there is a number of reasons why that could make some sense. You need to understand that point of view. And otherwise, it's hard to work with them. I mean, you can still disagree and say, this is not a good idea. It's a niche technology. Why would we do that? But at least you understand why there is that conclusion and why they're behaving in the way that why they're behaving in the way that they're behaving. And I like this. I think it's an American expression, or at least an English expression, this idea to walk in their shoes, right? To have to think about what it would feel like if you would be in their position. And you could call that empathy in a way, because it means that you care about what other people think and what they behave like. And this is actually a controversial statement, because there are people who say that the fundamental weakness of Western civilization is empathy. So there are links on the slides where you can actually go to the YouTube video where that person says that and explains it in more detail. He is actually talking about suicidal empathy, which I think is a very interesting term by itself. And the reason why I presented this slide is because, that man is awfully rich, right? So what I'm trying to talk about here is a way that I feel comfortable with, that I think I'm successful with, but there are other ways. If your goal is to become very, very rich, then maybe that's the better strategy. It's just that I would not use that strategy, or that, that kind of understanding of people. There are other people who basically say that the death of human empathy is one of the earliest and most telling signs of a culture about to fall into barbarism. That's a quote by Hannah Arendt, and she is a German and later then American historian and philosopher. She is the one who wrote that book about the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem. Well, in a way, I think this is probably something that you have to think about, that at the end of the day, we're working with people, and therefore empathy and trying to understand other people is one of the important parts of being able to do that and to do that ethically. There is also this point about decisions and autonomy. I would argue that decisions have two levels. So there is something that I would roughly call the quality of a decision. Is it a bad or a good decision? So if we are using that technology, maybe that's the better one, maybe it's the worst one. So there is a certain quality to that decision. But there is also an impact on autonomy. So would you let the team decide, or are you going to push a decision through? And as an example, I've taken JavaScript frameworks. So let's imagine that I make a decision about a JavaScript framework, which probably isn't a very good idea because that's not my area of expertise. And now I push that idea through. Autonomy is very low because I'm just pushing through that idea and, the team won't participate. And maybe I think my decision is a great idea. So from my point of view, this is obviously the best decision that you can make. But I'm not too sure because, in particular in my case, it would be great to listen to the team and to get some understanding from them with their experience and to get more feedback and to use their expertise. So maybe my decision isn't that good after all. And even if that decision is great, is it worth it? And I have to admit, if I think about a JavaScript framework, I would argue that you can be very successful with almost any JavaScript framework. So one of the really important points to figure out which framework I'm going to use is what the team feels comfortable with and what they have experience with. So if they all use Angular every day, why would I not use Angular? Makes a lot of sense, unless they say, well, we are using Angular every day and it's a mess. It doesn't work for us. So I think it makes sense to rather probably let the team decide. Maybe the quality of the decision is worse. Maybe it's better, but at least you get a very good level of autonomy. And, in terms of the JavaScript framework, it's hard for me to imagine that I would need to escalate that. I mean, what kind of decision would it be where I would say, well, this is going to be a real problem? I mean, you could think about, licenses that might be a problem, or maybe there are not too many committers. But, usually, or I don't see a huge risk there most of the time, and I would actually listen to the team. What about alignment with the other parts of the organization? Why would alignment with other parts of the organization why is that beneficial? So you want to limit the number of frameworks. So that's an interesting point. And let's imagine that everyone in the company is using Angular. Would that influence the decision? Obviously it would, right? And unless, there is a group of people who don't know Angular at all and who are very familiar with React. This kind of decision is something that I find really interesting because it sort of claims that this unification needs to be pushed through, while in reality the team has benefits from it. So therefore, that is a point, and I'm not settled on that point, whether you want to push through something to have it uniformly across all the organization. That might be a reason, but that's why I have these slides, right? It's because I think the autonomy makes sense. I would first let the team make the decision, and then I can still say, well, have you thought about how everyone else using Angular and how they're happy with it, or how there is a standard? So yeah, as I said, I'm probably not entirely settled. At the end of the day, it's about people in a way. So yeah, which means that it's about moderation, listening, convincing. It's not really about enforcing. And we just talked about how management can't really enforce things, right? How we all know how we can make sure that they don't happen. You need to make your expertise usable. And I think that's a general rule for managing self-organization. Self-organization doesn't mean that you would just have people who randomly do things it means that they somehow self-organize. So there has to be a framework where you can have that communication, where you can make decisions. This is something that you need to do. And there are small points in this regard. So for example, if you have a meeting and there's one person standing on the whiteboard, or there's one person giving a presentation like right now, it will be dominated by this person. And that's, in this case, what we're doing here, this is intentional, right? I'm the one who is giving the talk. I have some ideas that I want to talk to you about. But if we were a team and we were working together on something, then that might not be very helpful. And the other problem is that it's sequential, right? I'm standing here, I'm talking through the slides, I'm doing that in a sequential order, you're following along, so we are doing all the same. We could do something different. We could have discussion in pairs. We could use post-its, and there are lots of other ideas. And if I ask you to have a discussion in pairs, or if I ask you to write post-it and then we collect them, we are working in parallel, and we also get more and different ideas and opinions. And that might be useful. And also, introverts who don't want to, raise their hands in an audience like this and ask some questions or give some comments, which are highly welcome, those people would still be able to do a discussion in pairs or do post-it. And there are ideas like liberating structures, for example, that help you to do that and to organize that in more detail. So there is a catalog of patterns with different types of collaboration concepts. We learned that, or we started to do socio-technical architecture reviews. And the reason why we do this is because usually architecture reviews often focus on the software, on the architecture itself. But the software is a product of the social system. If you have some social system, a setup of teams, some people, they're probably bound to come up with some kind of architecture. So if you don't talk or think about the teams, then there is a problem. And therefore, we concluded that we would focus on the teams instead. And in our case, so we have quite a few successful reviews that we've done, and they often lead to a working team instead of a team that doesn't really work. And I think that's much more valuable than a slide deck that says, here are the 10 problems that you have in your architecture. And oftentimes, I'm doing reviews for quite some time. Oftentimes those slide decks are just ignored. So then the question is whether they are worth anything. We did an episode about that. There is also a link to on our website where you can take a look and find more information about this. One thing that I want to talk about is, and that's very important to me, is failure. So, talks like these make things seem very simple, right? So there is a slide deck. I hope the slide deck is convincing. Obviously, this is the way to go. And it seems like it's an easy way to work. I have to admit that at least me, I fail all the time in communication because there are misunderstandings, you're not in the best mood, and there are a lot of reasons why communication doesn't work the way that you intended to work. And communication by definition is never perfect. So the slides that I've just presented, the talk that I'm giving, I'm trying to express myself as clearly as possible. Still, there is a loss of information, and I've seen instances where I gave a presentation and that was entirely misunderstood. And that is just the nature of things. Sometimes it's also, you can just make sense of things that happened in communication and also with other people. If you think about them in retrospect, and we are not just driven by logic, we are also driven by emotions. So for me, it is essential to in particular concerning communication, in particular concerning soft skills, to point out that this is something where we all fail all the time, and we all have to, well, learn. So in conclusion, being an architect seems to be about hard skills, but I would argue that it's about a lot about soft skills. And, you know, if I look at the episodes that we did, the interviews that we did with people, they seem to say basically the same. So I would argue that you as the technical community, the development community actually know it. This can be taught and learned. So I skipped over a few slides that talk about how this is done in aviation and also in the military. So there are ways to teach communication and to teach how to make that happen. And lastly, we all fail all the time. If you enjoyed the talk, feel free to book a virtual coffee with me. So that would be a Teams or a Zoom call. I'm afraid that we don't send out coffee packets yet. So you would have to bring your coffee yourself. And I'm more than happy to discuss anything that you find interesting with me. And if you found the slides interesting, send an email to voxzurich2026@ewolff.com and you get a link to the slides. Your email address will be locked for 14 days. If you misspell the email address, those emails will be handled manually. So that's it, and that concludes my talk. I think we still have a few minutes for questions, right? 2 minutes. Okay, so questions. There is no QR code because we are, well, for technical reasons. It's better to use the email, I'm afraid. I don't want to dive into the details, and I hope you sympathize. Any other questions? There is one. So you don't want to override management decisions, you want to influence them? Yes, and I would even argue that it's your task as architects and also as developers is to provide feedback. And the reason why I gave the slides is because oftentimes I get the impression that, well, you know, management said, and now I don't have to think about anything. I mean, I'm just executing it, even though it's a stupid idea, and I think it's a stupid idea, but I'm not going to provide any feedback. And I can understand that because in some situations, you know, people have tried to provide feedback and it didn't work. And then at one point you're frustrated and you don't do it anymore. And that's fine and understandable. But generally speaking, I'm just disappointed because, well, you know, why wouldn't you provide feedback? At the end of the day, it's your project or it's the project of the overall team. So I think it's your duty to provide feedback even. The point about overriding is that this formal decision, you know, the person who actually makes the decision, that's probably a management person. And there is this misunderstanding where people seem to think, well, if we take this formal decisions from them, if we override that, that's somehow useful. I don't feel that way. That's the reason why I was talking about that case in particular. And it seems that, you know, generally people don't feel that way, right? They want to have that conversation really and want to be taken seriously. They don't want to have the formal way. So point is that if you ignore the manager, then you would get fired. But that might be the case, but I was talking about quite a few different strategies, right? The fearless change and so on. Ignoring the manager is like the bluntest idea that you can have. And obviously that's probably not the smartest idea. So thanks for pointing that out. Okay. So I'm a little bit over time, and I was presented the timer. So if you there are business cards here. I'm also going to be around for some time, but I'm going to catch a train back in an hour or so. So if you want, please come to the front, and we can still have a discussion. And thanks for being here, for listening to my talk, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.